All right, I think we are almost ready to get started. And um, what I'll say to folks is number one, thank you so much for joining us today. This is our faculty spotlight. This is the third of five faculty spotlights that we've had so far this year. And as you know, many of you have been admitted students. I know some of you are juniors that hopped in to get sort of the early preview. This day is really designed for you to get to know who our faculty are here at Reed. And I think if you've been able to join us before, it's been really nice to hear the people behind the majors, behind the programs, and imagining how you'd interact with the folks who have joined me today. So I'm going to start off by having folks do introductions. And then once we do that, because people are still filtering in, I'm going to give you a little background about how we're going to do our Q&A today. But I'm going to start with Zajj because of the Z. And what I'd like our faculty to do is let us know what department you're from, and let us know your specific discipline within the department. And then you can hand it off. We'll go Zajj, Margot, and then Chris.
Sure. Hi, I'm Zajj Daugherty. I am in the Department of Math and Statistics. And I am an algebraist and a combinatorialist. So I work in pure math.
Excellent. Thanks for coming, Zajj.
Hi, everybody. I'm Margot Minardi. I'm in the history department and the humanities program. And my main area is American history in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Excellent.
And hello, I'm Chris Koski. I'm in the political science department. I'm also in the environmental studies program. My primary focus is American politics, public policy, and as you might imagine, environmental policy.
Excellent. Thank you all. And so for our guest, again, so excited that you're here. What we're going to do today is you have the Q&A feature, and I know that's kind of new. We're used to all sort of being in the same room together. But I'm going to take your questions using the Q&A feature. So as soon as you type it, in order for me to manage it, I'm going to hit answer live, which moves it to a different area, but it helps me perform some triage so I can combine some of your questions. I can sort of pick and choose. I'll let you know we're going to get more questions than we have time to answer, and that's completely fine because we do have future events in which you can participate. But for today, I'm going to cover as many as possible to give you really great information. And everything is fair game. Anything you want to know, this is exactly what this session is for. So even though I may hit answer live and dismiss your question, I'll try to get to it, but we may not. But I just want to thank you for all of you contributing. It just makes this session a lot more interesting. So I think we have most of our folks there. So I'm going to start the faculty with a question that I asked earlier today with another set of your colleagues. Whenever I'm talking to another parent about my son, I'm always saying, I think he does wonderful things. I think he does things no one else does, right? And the truth of the matter is, when you were working at places or when you're teaching, we probably have experiences that no one else has. So, think about the conversations you have with your colleagues at other schools. Think about some of the conversations you have at conferences. I sort of imagine they might say something you're like, oh, I've just never experienced that at Reed. Things might be different. What are some of the unique features of teaching here at Reed of either the students that we might have that you sort of aren't hearing about at other places? And my goal today is to just give people a distinctive idea of what we think our students might have in common that we think is particularly special for us.
So I'll jump in. I think the thing that strikes me the most about Reedies is that the curiosity is off the charts. They just, like, the kinds of questions that I get, creative questions, things linking across not just different math classes, but sometimes it'll be like, we'll go over a new vocabulary word and somebody will be like, oh, I know a word that's like that from my chemistry class or from my poetry class. And what is the relationship I should be thinking of between those two things? So that's really fun. A lot of curiosity, a lot of trying to make connections across places.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. My experience talking with other faculty, other institutions, is I often will share a syllabi with them, and I'll talk through the interactions I have with classes. And I think it's probably a standard answer from Reed faculty is that, yeah, it's true. Our students are able to not just excel because they're bright, but also because, as Zajj has said, they're curious. And we're walking them through material which is quite complicated. I wouldn't hope to speak to combinatorial math. I don't know much about that. It's a word that I use maybe once or several years, but I can say that when I talk to folks at other conferences and I say, we're walking through this book I just assigned last semester called The Politics of Information, which is written by a couple of scholars in the policy field. And I was talking with a friend of mine at another institution. He's like, there's just no way that I could ever get students to actually understand that book. There's just no way. And it's not as if I'm trying to put Reed students through the ringer. It's in fact, it's sort of the opposite. And in many ways, the Reed students are pushing me as hard as I'm pushing them. And I think that's a pretty unique feature of the institution. We're working sort of synergistically academically.
Thanks, Chris. How about you, Margot?
No, I think both of these things that Zajj and Chris talked about are spot on. The curiosity and the kind of drive of students. I mean, I do think Reed students can be pretty unpredictable. So, I mean, I guess I have a particular image in my mind of Reed students, and then some student will shatter it. So like somebody was in my class the other day, I got into class and people were talking about team sports. And I was like, I have not heard this conversation at Reed before. This is very surprising to me, but it's like, when I reflect on it, on the one hand, we don't have formal sports teams the way that another institution might have, but on the other hand, we have all kinds of students who have all these interests that they could actually sustain for like 5 full minutes a conversation about team sports. So that's one thing about Reedies, is that they are constantly surprising me.
Yeah. I'll tell you what your colleague said, and it's surprising with how similar it is. They essentially said that one said, I had a conversation with my colleague and they were saying, I'm always trying to figure out ways to keep my students engaged. And Libby said, I just don't have that problem. My students are engaged. And that's really a gift, is this sort of curiosity, making connections with other disciplines. And almost what you said, Margot, is that there's nothing that's off limits, in a particular class. Does that also resonate with you all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conference model, which many of us adhere to, they also have lectures too, don't get me wrong. But the conference model doesn't.
Can you explain what the conference model is too, Chris?
I think Margot probably can explain better than I do, but the conference model is essentially where most of our classes act as though they're seminars, where faculty member may come in definitely comes in with some idea of what they want to do for the day. In some cases, that might be formalized. It might be something that even they have sent out beforehand. But ultimately, it's something where we really do, in many ways, depend upon students to show up prepared, not only that they have read the material, but also prepared to discuss it in ways that are not just sort of academic grandstanding, but are designed to facilitate learning from other students, such that in the perfect scenario, there's a kind of a consensus or a collective learning process that occurs in the classroom that would not have occurred absent that group of devoted people.
Mm-hmm.
So my experience with the conference model here is it really depends on this sort of a lot of commitment. It does not work in academic environments where people aren't committed to the material, aren't committed to the idea, because you can have you have seminars at many other institutions, and the seminars can ultimately be maybe longer versions of classes that are otherwise sort of stand and talk sorts of courses. And here, I think what we're kind of one of our major sort of selling features or product, whatever you want to call it, one of our major selling features of the institution is that students come here ready to learn from me, but also to learn from each other.
I'm gonna I think this is a later question, but I would love to sort of answer it in a different way. You're faculty here, but how do students have fun here? What are some of the ways you hear your students celebrating or having fun as an experience? We talk a lot about the academic program, but I think our families are sometimes curious about the other side that we don't always talk about. So just one or two folks, tell me about some of the fun stuff that you hear your students talking about.
Wait, Milyon, are you assuming that the historiography of the Mexican-American War is not fun?
I am. Zajj said that. I didn't. But if you could correct her, that would be great.
I mean, I'll be honest, like I think this is a better question for students, but I will also okay, students do all kinds of stuff. So I have a student who's writing a proposal to okay, maybe starting with writing a proposal was not the
Yeah,
thing to
yeah.
talk about, but I guess partly it's like there's not always a line between these things because the student's idea is to get Reed funding to in the summer go and hang out at cafes in Germany and like observe cafe culture in Germany. And actually that reminds me, speaking of cafes, you know, I remember when I first visited Reed as an interviewee, and I was in the student cafe like listening to what students were talking about. And they were talking about how much they loved working on their art thesis, and someone else was doing another thesis. So I don't mean to suggest that the only way students have fun is by doing classwork and applying for grants, but like there is a way in which people here are really driven by the things that they're intellectually and creatively passionate about, and that those can kind of seep into different aspects of their lives. But as I said, you know, I also have students who went to the ski cabin last weekend, which Reed owns and which students can visit. I have the students who got together and watched the Super Bowl, which I was surprised by, you know, but sparked this conversation in class. My Hum 110 conference, every Friday we go around the room and everybody shares their favorite something. And so students have talked about video games, concerts, favorite app on their phone, and I learned about some games I didn't know about. But so I think people are like as eclectic as you can get, but often students find at Reed someone who shares their own kind of niche interest in a way that might be a little bit harder in some than in some high school environments.
Well said.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some organized activities on campus which don't involve proposals. One of which is mock trial. That's pretty popular. It wasn't until a couple of years ago. I am constantly encouraging students to go to particular places in the city to play pinball. It is Portland, Oregon, so there's a lot of music people can go to. And my thesis student just went to watch some monster trucks last weekend. So it is a pretty wide range of stuff.
And I wanted to ask you all that on purpose because you are faculty, and it does highlight that our students can be playful. You know, they can go out and have relaxed. It's not just rigor and homework, and so those don't have to be, Margot, as you pointed out, mutually exclusive. And I said because we had a few questions about, you know, is it stressful? And join our student panels. Our students do a really nice job of talking about how they get support and how they balance that out. But it's going to lead me into my second question, and I'm going to make it a two-part question. I'm calling you Margot, Chris, Zajj. Our students call you by your first name, right? Audrey, who is the president of the college, Audrey, and you don't flinch at that. That's kind of different, and that we're sort of naming people in this fashion, and it's cultural. And part of that, well, I won't say what part of that is. I would love you to say what part of that, why you think that is, or what it does for our community. And I'm going to stretch this a little into a second question. Maybe someone can hit this, is how that relationship building goes. And actually, I'm going to reserve my second question, let you answer the first one.
I mean, I would dovetail on what Chris said earlier about this idea that when answering the question about conference, that there's a real premium placed on students learning from each other. But I think that extends in all directions. That and I could cite many specific examples, but like I'm constantly learning from my students. And so kind of knowledge and insight are traveling in all sorts of directions. So I think we aspire to, I don't know that we always achieve, but we aspire to a kind of non-hierarchical environment where people might have formal titles that place them in a particular institutional structure, but everyone is here sharing a kind of common goal to learn and to improve and to contribute to the community. And the informality around names and communication kind of as part of that aspiration, or as part of working toward that aspiration.
Yeah, I think coming from other institutions kind of recently, I was a little bit nervous about this, right? So in other environments, titles become this way of expressing respect for each other. And I think when I got here, I thought I was a little bit like, oh, are we all just like the same? And that's not what it has come as, right? So I think it is this mutual respect that we can all call each other by our first names because we develop connections and we develop relationships in the classroom. But my students respect me for my knowledge and my experience, and I respect them for the hard work and the intellectual prowess that they bring into the classroom and the engagement and the way that we all drive each other. And so it really is about that like connection that we have. And because we all work with integrity and have respect for each other, being able to call each other by our first names doesn't undermine that.
How much homework do students have? How much are you assigning the load outside of the classroom?
I think this really, really varies by discipline. My guess is that by homework, I'll probably put a page count on reading, and then on number of papers, whereas Zajj and other folks in M&S might think of it differently. I have no idea, but I think for an intro course, we're thinking about we have about 100 to 150 pages a week of reading, and then we have 5 assignments throughout the semester of varying kinds in our American politics class, for example. One of them is sort of a timed 48-hour midterm. Another one is a forecasting exercise, which is mostly about interpreting or predicting the number of seats that are going to be picked up in an election. There's another one, which is a final exam. So for the lower division classes, I think at least for political science, it's pretty standard fare to have 100 to 150 and 3 to 5 papers, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Can you all? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Margot.
I just wanted to say on that, without getting into the details, like I think the important thing for students to think about coming from high school to college is that in many college classes, you will spend more time preparing for class than you will spend in class. And so that sometimes that's the inverse of your high school experience, depending on your high school, but that's just the thing to think about. So you might only see me in class for 3 hours a week, but I would expect you to be doing like 6 to 9 hours outside of class to prepare for it.
Can you all talk a bit about the type of research one might do in your department? 1 or 2 examples. And I love this because oftentimes when we're outside of the sciences, people say, oh, you can do research in humanities. And so our sort of breadth of curiosity for students isn't limited to certain academic disciplines. You can really move across the curriculum and explore things more deeply. So how might students do that with you, or what have students done in the past? And Zajj, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So in math, research looks like, you develop a certain kind of familiarity with certain techniques in fields of mathematics, and then you learn how to ask questions over time. And so it becomes this idea of pursuing a question, and where did the question come from kind of motivates how the research proceeds. So like maybe we do a bunch of examples, maybe we read some of the literature, maybe we run some data. And so like whether that's my own research or whether that's, I just had a couple of students, I had 5 students submit various funding proposals this morning, looking at a couple of different projects. One of them is joint with physics, where there's a certain kind of physical model that it turns out that like in order to understand that more deeply, they need some results from mathematics. So our job this summer is to kind of build that interdisciplinary bridge. Whereas I have another couple of students who are working with kind of a more puzzly type of thing, where there's some rules about how certain points are connected by edges, and then you glue them together and you try to spot patterns. So you just do a whole bunch of examples and start to look for structure that emerges. So that's pretty exciting.
What about you, Margot?
Just
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Margot, please.
Oh, okay. So hold on, I have some visual aids. So you said 1 or 2 theses, so I happen to have these near me. So this was made by one of my students' moms. It's a portrait of Nat Love, who was a Black cowboy in the early 20th century and wrote a narrative. Oh, thanks. And wrote an autobiography. And the student, the thesis was an analysis of Nat Love and the Black cowboy narrative, and kind of putting it in context of other autobiographical traditions in the United States. So that's one. Then over here we have this. So this is a
Wow.
map of North Haven and Vinyl Haven, Maine. This is one of the first theses I advised, which was on the granite industry in Maine. So this is a student who came from coastal Maine. That was kind of his background, his people, and he wrote a fabulous thesis looking at the granite industry in Maine. So you can, I mean, everything, as we say in history, everything has a history. So a history thesis could potentially be about almost anything. But those are just two examples.
Do you have a prop for every thesis that's gone through your
I wish I did, but I don't. Those
That
were
was impressive to have visuals. How about you, Chris? Oh, I'm sorry. Before we leave, Margot, can you explain what a thesis is?
Yeah, so a thesis is a piece of original scholarship by a student. They're required of every student at Reed. You do this in your senior year, and it's a project where you are working under the advisorship of a faculty member, and it can vary from department to department how closely aligned your own project is with the faculty member's project. So I know in some sciences, it may involve working in a scientist's lab and kind of taking a small piece of a larger project that other people are working on. In my field, they tend to be a little bit more independent. So students are often working on things very different from what I'm working on. But it's kind of the culmination of your Reed career insofar as you're drawing on the skills that you've learned throughout your time in that major, but even sometimes on skills you learned outside the major, and pursuing, as Zajj suggested, kind of a question that is particularly of interest to you using the methods and theories of that field.
Very good. Thank you. Chris, you were going to say one?
Oh, sure. I didn't know if you want to move on. Yeah, I work typically every summer. There's so many different structures for people to work with students. There's the thesis structure with which every student's going to work with the faculty member individually. There are many other sort of paid opportunities that students and faculty work together over the summer. Some folks have large labs. In our department, it's more like sort of a Sith Lord sort of situation where there's only two. There's a master and apprentice sort of thing. This summer in particular, I'm looking at I'm looking at the.
I just wanted to make sure I heard you right.
Yeah, you got it. I'm looking at the extent to which governors are talking about climate change in their State of the State speeches, and we're going to track the issue of climate change over time relative to other issues, so we can see which years it's prominent and which years it isn't, whether it's prominent amongst Democrats versus Republicans, and in what ways are they talking about it. So that's just one example of something I'm doing this summer.
Chris, I've got another question for you that's specific. How can students combine, well, actually, it's for a few of you. How can students combine poli-sci, history, and stats as an interdisciplinary study? Is that even possible at Reed? And I think it's not just about the specific question, but sort of this idea of having multiple interests.
Well, I mean, first of all, and my colleagues and the other interests can help out, but first of all, the group structure at the college is pretty broad, and it enables people to really, I mean, even though there are specific requirements regarding which groups people have to take and et cetera, the upshot is that there's a lot of broad classes you can take to fulfill any kind of, to both graduate as well as pursue what you want. There are specific interdisciplinary majors that would cover exactly what the specific question here. For example, I'm thinking about ICPS, which is International Comparative Policy Studies. That combines these two things. There are multiple opportunities also now to minor in different disciplines. So there are, whereas it's very uncommon to double major at the institution, it's not as if that reduces the scope of the coursework that people can take. I have plenty of students who've taken classes with Margot and also taken classes Well, not yet with Zajj, but I'm sure we see lots of overlap. And I see that in particular in environmental studies, which is inherently an interdisciplinary major that spans both folks in the natural sciences and the folks in the social sciences, as well as people in humanities via history.
Excellent. Thank you. Um, let's see. How large can you all tell me the size of your most recent conference class or a typical conference class? And our average classroom size is 16, but that's the average. And I know there is some variance, but how many students are you usually seeing in your classes overall?
So over here, we tend to run not so much the conference style, but we do like lecture and then work. So rather than sitting around in discussion, but even those classes tend to be pretty small. So I have 2 upper level classes that are about 15 people each. And then I had 2 sort of like sophomore level classes last semester that were about 15 people. And my like they've all been about 15 people.
Yeah, I teach in Humanities 110, which is the required intro class, and that is typically 16 students, so right at the average, which is a pretty good conference size. I'm currently doing an upper level 400 level history course, so that only has 8 students in it, which is really great, but it has some prerequisites. I would say intro level history courses usually have about 20 to 24 students.
Mhm.
And the same thing, there's a very similar distribution for political science, to be honest. My classes tend to be a little more packed because I also teach environmental classes, but for the most part, and packed is a loose term, right? 24 is the biggest class we have. But this semester, I'm actually pretty fortunate. I have got 16 and 13 in one section, and then 24 in another. But it's all, I know everybody's name and where they're from and what they want to do with their lives.
So I have another really important question for Margot. If Reed was if Reed was a historian, who would Reed be?
Oh, that's such a great question. Did you come up with that, or was that some student, Milyon?
I am responsible for that question 100%. But we could buy you some time if you need some help, because I
Well, I
still have
mean,
the
so
books
I was
behind
no,
you.
I don't know about historian. So okay, so my first
Not slated the
thought went
famous
to
person in history, but
yeah.
it seemed too
No,
easy.
no. So my first thought went to John Reed, who was a journalist, like a radical journalist who wrote about the Mexican Revolution and other things. And one reason I think of him is because he's a little bit of a maverick, but also people always think Reed is named for him, but it wasn't. Because he
Interesting.
was from Portland. But I think there's probably a reason people think Reed was named for him, because he had maybe a mentality that is maybe associated with a stereotyped vision of Reed. But you know what? On Friday in Hume, we're reading a great essay by the polymath but trained historian W.E.B. Du Bois, who called The Propaganda of History. And in that piece, he is kind of very critical of what is happening in the historiography or the history written about Reconstruction in his day. But he also kind of in that piece does not limit himself to being the kind of very factual oriented historian, but also goes into this very powerful poetic reverie at the end. So that kind of unwillingness to accept orthodoxy in a field combined with his willingness to go from, factual analysis to the realm of art, like that seems very Reed to me.
Wow. I love that answer. That's really great. And I think one of the things that I also hear is the connections that you're making as you're even talking about it, what your connections like our students make. Chris, I'm going to ask you a similar question. If Reed were a pinball game, which pinball game would it be? You've got to tell folks
Boy,
I'm
yeah,
asking you
I
that
do.
question.
For people who don't know me, which is literally everybody except for the folks I can see, I do play a lot of pinball. And I have a hard time with whether I should pick a classic table because we do have a classic educational model here. So I'm thinking of something like, oh, I don't know, Gorgar or Pinbot. These are all sort of standard tables. Or if I should pick something that's a little more complicated with more a sort of what we call a deeper rule set, something that takes a longer time to sort out. And I think particularly given some of the t-shirts I've seen, which have sort of throwbacks to 80s and 90s music, which I appreciate as somebody who grew up in that era. I think I'd be approach the Iron Maiden table, which I do hope that many of you play. You can choose your favorite Iron Maiden song, and it is a really deep rule set. Lots of different skill sets can play that table. I will happily explain further, but I'm guessing that you not want me to go.
I like when I Google folks and show them which game you're talking about. Feel free to chat it out. Zajj, for you, I know it's going to get really tricky. So if you, one of the ways that I think people find entryways into college is because they have a passion in life. You had a certain, I asked you, how did you get into math? Why was it important to you? And you shared, I think, a really thoughtful story. And talk about what stories you hear about students coming here to Reed and getting into the program and getting into the major. And I think people would be curious about your story too.
Stories that I hear about students getting into the major and my story. Well, I think the story I shared with you is that, I grew up, my mom makes children's clothing, and it was something that she could do from home a lot of the time, but also have her own business. And I grew up with her showing me how clothes got put together and how she designed them and the pattern making that she had and how they got assembled. And so I learned a lot of spatial reasoning from that. And it took me a long time. I had a dysfunctional relationship with math for a long time. It didn't feel like it was for me. But it turns out that a lot of the things I was excited about as a kid and as a young adult were exactly the kind of training that I needed to be a mathematician professionally. So I see some people come up through, they know they love math, and they've been studying advanced mathematics even before they get here. Some people have incredible backgrounds, but then some people are like just trying to hack their way through the grunt work of algebra and pre-calculus and calculus, not really getting it. But then they might come here and take something like discrete structures, which is one of our entry-level classes, where they get to play with little like combinatorial techniques and puzzles and graphs and counting arguments and stuff. And then they go, oh, this feels really different. And it becomes this new playground where they can think a little bit differently and creatively in a different way. And they can use some of these, like, if they really like crosswords and they really like certain kinds of puzzle games, it turns out that just like interfaces quite nicely with some avenues of math.
Thank you, Zajj, for sharing that. And while while we're on math, what are some of the prerequisites for topology and for number theory?
Off the top of my head. Okay, so
and maybe you can talk generally about what type of preparation they need to sort of move forward and how you sort of scaffold students to take a particular class.
So for our entry-level classes, prerequisites are 3 years of high school math. So that's calculus, and that's discrete structures, and that's our intro to statistics and probability courses. From there, in the math curriculum, we very quickly start getting into logical manipulation and proofwriting techniques in order to integrate some of the things that you're learning in other areas about good communication and thinking critically about things, but now we put them into a mathematical framework. And so it's this wonderful privilege. A lot of times that stuff doesn't come until much later, but our students from like the second semester in a math major are learning how to prove things, how to argue things formally, and how to communicate them in more sophisticated ways. So this stuff ramps up really quite quickly. So when you talk about like topology and number theory, those are upper level classes. You have to get through some of the core stuff here, but we do really interesting things with our first and second year courses that you don't see in a lot of other places, because that development comes a little bit later.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to answer some quick hit questions that folks want to know. Let's see. So Reed does have a dual degree engineering program. Some students do take advantage of that. That's something that you want to talk with your advisor about right away when you start, in order to sort of figure out those pathways, particularly as they lead into grad school opportunities. Regular decisions will come out really soon. So I'm looking at my watch, and so you won't have to wait too long. They'll definitely be out before, I anticipate before the middle of March. But yeah, sooner rather than later. We issue the rankings. What's up with that? So yes, we think that that hinders the quality of education? Absolutely not. Rankings have nothing to do with whether or not you're a good school. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've really walked away from the rankings. They measure some stuff, but what they measure, the stuff that's important for you may certainly be different. And so some of you have joined my Navigating Selective College Admission website. We spend the first 20 minutes talking about what US News and World Report is, because that is sort of the gold standard of rankings, why those are important, and why you might think they're not important, to give you a better idea of our perspective. What we've decided is our approach to education, what we think is helpful for students out in the world. When folks are working on the rankings, they're all sort of chasing down the same criteria. We think that leads to a lack of distinction, and we don't think that places the appropriate emphasis where it needs to be, which is on you and learning. And that's something that we do really well. So no, I want to make sure the tail's not wagging the dog there. So for Margot, history, field trips, working out in the field, do people go on archaeology sites? Do they take part in excavations? What might be ways that people will sort of do some practical side of being a history major?
That's a great question. So there is an archaeologist at Reed, Tom Landvater, and he's actually in the Greek, Latin, and Ancient Mediterranean Studies department. And he does take some students on digs in the summer, most recently in Cyprus and in the Mediterranean. Generally, at most schools, archaeology is actually a separate discipline from history. So but he's in that what used to be called a classics department. Historians do the kind of field for many historians is the archive. We have an excellent archive and special collections department at the Reed Library. And so I actually currently have a student research assistant who's working with the papers of Thomas Lamb Eliot, who is the namesake of the building that the admission office is in. So that can happen locally, but the college also has funding to send students to archives in other places if they want to do work there. And that would mean, going usually into some basement somewhere and getting boxes of old stuff and reading it, transcribing it, sometimes scanning it. I would also say a lot of history has shifted into the digital realm because a lot of material is digitized now. And so students are actually able to do a lot of work with historical primary sources, even just from campus, because we have a library with an extremely generous collections policy. So we actually this is one thing actually, Milyon, that my colleagues at other schools are really jealous of. Our library resources are exceptional, and we have access to things that students at many small colleges can't access. This is true for history, but for other disciplines as well.
And librarians who will help students seek out information they need,
Absolutely.
discover ideas, who are also very familiar with the subject content. Absolutely.
Yeah, and students when they come in are actually assigned to a personal librarian. So if you ever have any question about how to use the library or just like any information needs at all, you can contact that person and they will be delighted to hear from you.
The only school that I know that actually does that. I have the de-emphasis of grades. I often talk about this. Reed students indeed do receive a grade. I've heard a faculty member say when that grade is sometimes the end of the conversation, whereas our approach is to continue that conversation about learning and focusing on ideas. But I think when you're coming from high school, this idea of not getting grades sort of seems frightening. There is a bit of this in this question about sort of grade deflation, which I don't at all think this is the case at Reed at all. I actually think grade inflation is more like grade compression at most any school. But can you all talk a little bit about how de-emphasizing the grade creates a different construct in the classroom? Or what does de-emphasizing the grade do in terms of setting up a learning experience for a student?
I mean, I'll say one thing to that, because I think this is not something I would have expected when I was a student myself. If a student that I had in class last year shows up at my office and starts talking to me, I just want to stress, I have no clue whatsoever what grade that student got in my class. Like, it's just like, it is not, I do not like see a student around campus and like I see a B+ on them or something like that. I think that's a big part of it for me, is that you exist separate from your grades, and your grades are so minor to my understanding of who you are. So I will remember that that student wrote a really fabulous paper analyzing Supreme Court opinions on affirmative action, but I can't, like, the grade is not the important part of it for me. And I would have been stressed out by that, honestly, as a student, by not having that. You can always ask your professors for feedback in the form of grades if that is more helpful to you. I think as students get used to Reed, they start to appreciate more getting more descriptive feedback, or feedback that is more oriented toward thinking about how they might improve on the next assignment or the next version of the current assignment. So I think there is a little bit of a transition period, but my sense is that for most people, it is kind of a relief to not have your worth measured in some way by a letter.
I think a lot of what we've been talking about comes together in my mind with this de-emphasis of grades, which is that how do you get to a place where as a senior, you're sitting around at the cafe chatting about how much fun you're having with your thesis that went off in this direction with your friend whose thesis went off in that direction? How do you get there? You weren't born that way. You have to learn a lot of skills about communication and inquiry. And some of them you'll come here with, but some of them you will learn while you're in college. And so taking the pressure off the grade makes the focus more on the long game, which is how do I grow? How do I learn? How do I get better each day, each week, each semester, each month, each year, right? How do I improve over time, and how do I learn better? And by taking some of that fixation on the points and the actual like benchmarks and the short-term things, because grades happen very quickly, you're able to focus more on that long trajectory.
So we've so many questions, and we're not going to be able to cover them all. I've asked our faculty to take one or two of these questions and type an answer to it. And Chris, if you ultimately could type an answer to our question about some of the notable PhD students that you've advised, that would be great. I'm going to answer, again, a few quick hits while we're sort of thinking about that, and then I'm going to follow up with a question. The first is about, let's see, I think it was PhD production. Actually, no, I'm going to have Chris answer that. So Reed produces more PhDs per capita than any other school in the United States, except for Caltech, Harvey Mudd, and Swarthmore. That means more PhDs per 100 student than any of these three places. And we go back and forth with Swarthmore. And I only say that because this PhD conversation comes up a lot. So why do we talk about that? We think that is a quantitative, not calculated like the rankings way, to give you all an idea of how you might be successful in the future, which is to say that if you do well at Reed, you will do well anywhere. You will have the capacity to do well. It doesn't mean that everyone will get a PhD or that you have to get a PhD. So in order to be one of the nation's leaders in PhD production, that's about anywhere from 15 to 30% of your students getting a PhD. So it's not all of our students. And so I just want to let you know that that is not a requirement for you coming here and being successful, but we do think it speaks to the idea that your education will give you that opportunity, and it has done more so than even many of the Ivies. There is a quick question about sort of the stress culture and here at Reed. One of the reasons I had the faculty sort of talk about if their students are actually engaged outside the classroom, because I wanted to people understand that rigor need not be rigid, that you can also have some balance in your Reed career, and that we think a lot about that. We have a great system of mental health resources. And then the student also mentioned drug culture. So I talk about this caricature of Reed. I think, Margot, I sort of heard you say, some people might think this about Reed. That is a caricature of Reed. Join Carnell McConnell Black, who's the Vice President of Student Life, and I, when we have a tough questions session. Reed's data when it comes to drug culture, when it comes to drugs, when it comes to drinking, we are not exceptional in that way. We're just like every other private liberal arts college. And so this sort of perception of Reed has gotten ahead of us, and the reality is simply not the case. And that hasn't been the case at Reed for at least 15 years. And so I want you all to know that that is a holdover, and it doesn't reflect our campus community, and the data doesn't support it. But come and join Carnell and I as we answer some of these other tough questions that deal with this sort of caricature that I think doesn't accurately identify who we are. Transfer students, we do a lot of integration with transfer students. You're going to be set up just fine. There's no disadvantage for starting Reed later in your career. We put you on academic planning. Before you even say yes, we have you meet with an advisor in your field so you know exactly what you're getting into and how your credits will transfer before you're checking that box. I'm going to ask probably 2 more questions of our faculty. And I know they're responding to some of these live. This is pretty straightforward. How do we manage for folks that have different ability levels? And so, there's a version of this where everyone comes in and they're this perfect student that we've always been looking for. But we know that, realistically speaking, people come with different strengths, different skills. And so can you all talk a little bit about how we support all students here at Reed and help them succeed?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a huge part of teaching for the first year students, because I teach first years every year in Hum 110. And one thing that I really like to stress in that is that everybody comes in with something, like something that they're strong at and things that they are less strong at. And I think that part of the value of having a course where, and I should say in Hum 110, you meet one-on-one with your professor at least 7 times per year. One of the values of having a course like that where you have so much individual contact is that I do a lot of work just to ask students about their previous learning experiences, what's been hard for them, what they feel more confident about. And a lot of it is just about drawing out people's strengths and finding ways to help them with the things that they need help with. So I guess my short answer to your question is kind of like individually tailored learning / kind of artisanal teaching. But yeah, and also I would just remind people that I think sometimes going to college is a little bit overwhelming and you feel like everyone else is qualified to be here and somehow you're not. But I can say Milyon makes no mistakes. So, I mean, everyone and his team makes no mistakes, right? So everyone has something that brought them here. And it's about just kind of like tapping into that as a resource that helps you to work on the things that might be newer to you.
And Margo raises some really important points, notably that we know the students particularly well. So in the classroom, we're going to know pretty quickly what your strengths and weaknesses are, and we're going to allow you to expand upon those strengths when you have an opportunity. For example, we know you know something about, I don't know, Republicans in rural states. I'll talk to you about that. But then also we'll try to work on you. We'll try to push you on the things you don't know as well. And one of the ways that we do that often in environmental studies, we have a research class that's it's the first class in the sequence. We put people in groups and we put people together who have different talents and different interests because it's such an interdisciplinary major. And the idea is that you not only are we as faculty helping you, but we try to create a team mentality such that the students are also supporting each other.
I would say we see the same thing in math here. We get a lot of collaboration. We really try to encourage students to talk to not just people who are kind of at their same skill level, but folks who have different strengths or different struggles. We have lots of like drop-in tutoring and course assistants. So other undergraduates who are there to help you, in addition to all of us have lots of office hours and are generally around with our doors open, and try to make those kinds of individual connections.
Molly asked a great questions that other folks might be curious about. Can you do independent studies or research? I think this, the senior thesis is really, I think that's crafted for you to explore ideas that haven't been explored before. And I think other learning opportunities really happen when you're having great conversations with your advisor or your faculty members saying, I want to learn more about this. How does that happen? We are 5 minutes over, so I'm going to ask you all one last question. And I've been saving it. So Mike, thank you for sending it early on. What is the most rewarding aspect of being a faculty member at Reed?
I mean, I think for me, it's just I think we've kind of already touched on this, but like constantly coming into contact with intellectually curious and passionate people who come up with things that you have never thought of before. And lest you think that I am just saying this out of some sort of rote sense of responsibility, that literally happened to me like 2 hours ago when I was in class and students said something that made me like very seriously rethink an argument that I was thinking of making in a piece of my own scholarship. So that was a little
Wow,
deflating, but also very Reed.
that's so neat. Thanks for sharing that.
Mhm.
Was it a surprise to you?
Yeah, I thought I was right. I mean, they made me question that.
It is. I got to tell you, it's thrilling and refreshing for someone who I respect and think are generally right to say, you know what, I have to rethink my ideas. And I think, I don't know, I think that says a lot about character. Chris, Zajj?
One of the things I really like about it here is the freedom, academic freedom that we all enjoy. And that has to do everything to do with the classroom environment. We promote a very respectful classroom environment. We often, particularly I teach political science, so obviously we're going to have folks that have definite opinions about things. But I will say that people in general understand this to be an academic environment first. And so they're often not spouting off they're going to have some attitudes based upon something they've learned before. And as a faculty member, this freedom also enables me to teach a wide variety of classes that I might not attempt with undergraduates. There's no formal curriculum that I have to follow specifically for the classes I teach. I think that's very useful for myself personally, but also for the students.
Thank you, Chris.
I absolutely echo what both Margot and Chris have said. So I'm going to say something maybe totally in a different vein, which is this campus is amazing. Like we have a nature preserve in the middle of campus, so I can be super up in my head and thinking really technically, and I can just go outside and walk like 100 feet that way and be in the middle of the woods, and that's very helpful for the overall intellectual pursuits.
Yeah, it's a beautiful setting. I want to thank the three of you for joining me today. You make me proud to be a part of Reed's community. And I know that we have a lot of families who came out to hear what you had to say about the college. So thank you so much. And I also want to thank our families for joining us. We have 2 more faculty spotlights. And then there's going to be some respite before we really move into our programming, where we do deep dives on academic programming for you to find out more about, if you're interested in political science, exactly what that's about. And we're asking our faculty to try to bring students there so you can hear a bit of perspective. And I know a lot of you are coming to campus. We've got 6 Reed Admit days. And if you haven't visited yet, I know for some of you that really cements what it's like. And if questions come up, call your personal admission counselor. It's our job to help you make an informed decision about where you want to be for 4 years. You deserve no surprises. So I hope you all have a great night. And this will be available later on our website. And again, thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.